The arrival. Marcia's fingers lingered for a brief moment on the glove compartment latch. A familiar weight pressed against her chest as she realized the officer hadn't just stopped her because of a minor speed infraction. There was something else in the way he was standing, in the stillness of his movements. He was assessing her. More than the speed, more than the paperwork, he was assessing her. It was a feeling she had become all too accustomed to throughout her career. That subtle, almost imperceptible way people looked at her, the judgment they tried to hide behind professional facades. She had learned early on how to mask her emotions, how to shield herself from the weight of their eyes. But today it felt harder to ignore. The officer's footsteps crunched softly on the pavement as he moved back to his patrol car. Marcia's eyes followed him through the rearview mirror, watching as he approached his vehicle with deliberate slowness, as though deciding on how to handle the situation. A deep breath escaped her lips, her mind circling around the reality she was facing. The feeling of being an outsider. The feeling of constantly having to prove she belonged. The city skyline loomed larger in the distance. This wasn't just any city, and this wasn't just any precinct. It was one with deep-rooted traditions, a precinct where most of the officers had been there for decades, where new ideas were met with resistance, especially when those ideas came from someone they hadn't chosen. They hadn't chosen her. Marcia had earned her place, fought her way through every rank and barrier, but there were still whispers about her. There were still people who didn't believe in her or what she represented. As she sat in the driver's seat, waiting for the officer's return, she couldn't help but wonder how many of her future interactions with these officers would mirror this moment. How many times would she have to explain her every move, justify her existence in this role? It was a burden, one she had learned to carry over the years, but today it felt different. Today, on her first day as chief of police, it was a test she wasn't sure she was ready to face. The officer's footsteps grew louder as he returned to her car. His shadow fell across her windshield, blocking the sunlight for a brief moment. He stood there, staring down at her through the glass, as if searching for something, waiting for her to make the first move. Marcia didn't flinch. She had no reason to. When he finally spoke, his voice was colder, more formal than before. "I'll need to see your ID, ma'am." His words hung in the air, sharp and clinical, but there was a subtle shift in his tone, a hint of uncertainty, maybe even discomfort. The power dynamics had changed. It wasn't just about the traffic stop anymore. Something else was at play. Marcia reached for her wallet, her movements deliberate, calm. Her fingers brushed over her badge. As she pulled out her driver's license, she held it up, but just before handing it to him, she made a choice. This wasn't going to be like all the other interactions. This wasn't going to be a moment where she simply complied, where she let herself shrink under the weight of someone else's assumptions. She handed him both her license and her badge. The officer took them from her hand, his fingers brushing against hers for just a moment longer than necessary. His gaze flickered to the badge, and his body tensed, a slight pause in his movements. For the briefest second, it looked like he might drop the cards, his grip faltering, but he regained himself quickly. "Chief Wilson," he read aloud, his voice almost a whisper. Marcia's heart beat a little faster, but she kept her face neutral. "That's right," she said firmly. "I'm the new chief of police. The one you're going to work for." The words hung in the air, a challenge wrapped in a statement of fact. She knew she was throwing a gauntlet at his feet. She knew that by revealing herself, she had stepped beyond the usual protocol of a routine traffic stop. But she wasn't going to let this officer or anyone else question her authority. The officer's face hardened, and he cleared his throat. "I wasn't aware, ma'am." He paused, as if struggling to find the right words. "I didn't realize we had a new chief." Marcia raised an eyebrow. "It's only been in the papers for the last few weeks." He shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward his patrol car as though seeking some form of guidance, some script to follow. But there was no script for this. There was no manual on how to process a black woman in a leadership position, a woman who had fought tooth and nail for every inch of respect she'd gained. "Chief, The officer began again, his voice softer now, almost apologetic. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "You didn't know." Marcia finished for him, her tone clipped but not unkind. "It's fine. But I expect you to know in the future." The officer nodded, though the discomfort was still evident in his posture. He took a step back, still holding her ID and badge in his hand, as though trying to reconcile the image of the woman in front of him with the title she held. There was an awkward silence between them now. The officer seemed unsure of how to proceed, his professionalism slipping into uncertainty. This was new for him, and Marcia knew it. She could feel the weight of the shift in the air. Finally, the officer cleared his throat again, handing her back her documents. "I'll let you off with a warning this time, Chief Wilson," he said, his voice now fully formal, respectful in a way it hadn't been moments before. "Just, please keep it under the limit next time. And welcome to the city." Marcia took the documents, her hand steady as she accepted them. She didn't offer a smile. She didn't need to. She had already won. "Thank you, officer," she said simply, her voice firm but not unkind. "I'll be sure to remember the limit." As the officer stepped back, Marcia took a deep breath and turned her key in the ignition. The engine hummed to life. She didn't look back as she drove away, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, on the city that was now her responsibility. But something inside her shifted. She knew this was just the beginning, that this was only one small moment in a much larger story that had yet to unfold. She had passed the first test, but there would be many more to come. And she was ready to face them all, head on. The city stretched out before her, its buildings standing tall, as if waiting for her to make her mark. Today had been a moment of reckoning, but it would not define her. Not today. Not ever. She was Chief Marcia Wilson, and she would change everything. The first day. The day had barely begun, yet it already felt like a lifetime. Marcia Wilson drove through the streets of the city, her eyes scanning the roads, but her mind was elsewhere. The familiar hum of her car engine did little to quiet the storm inside her. The conversation with the officer kept replaying in her mind, his unease, the way he had hesitated when reading her title. Chief. It still felt surreal, a reminder of how far she had come, but also how much further she still had to go. The precinct she was headed to wasn't like the others she had worked at. This was the heart of the city's policing system, a precinct with a long history of tradition, a precinct where things were done a certain way, and had been done that way for decades. The walls of this place would not be easy to break down, but she had spent her career learning how to navigate tough environments, how to turn doubt into resolve, and how to make people believe in things they couldn't see at first. As she approached the precinct, her thoughts turned to the officers she would meet. She had already encountered their suspicion in the briefest of interactions, like the one with the officer who had stopped her. They didn't know what to make of her. An outsider in a place that revered its own. To them, she wasn't just a new face. She was a disruption, a sign of change that many would resist. The city's streets were lined with the kind of people who thought things had always been fine the way they were. And to them, the idea of a woman, especially one of color, leading the precinct was something that didn't fit into their narrow view of what a leader looked like. But Marcia wasn't just any woman. She wasn't here to please anyone. She was here to prove that she was the right choice, that she had earned this position the hard way, and that no one could hold her back from doing her job. The precinct was an imposing building. From the outside, it looked much like any other government building in the city, cold, uninviting, with sharp lines and muted colors that did little to inspire warmth. But Marcia wasn't intimidated. The building might have been designed to look like an institution, but it was made up of people. And she was about to step in and reshape those people, even if they didn't want to be shaped. She parked her car in front of the entrance and sat for a moment, staring at the building. The weight of the day pressed heavily on her shoulders. The weight of expectation. She knew she was walking into the lion's den, but she had come prepared. She'd spent years working her way through the ranks, weathering storms that were meant to break others. She could handle this. Taking a deep breath, Marcia stepped out of her car and walked toward the building. As she pushed through the door, the first thing she noticed was the silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from peace or focus. It was the kind of silence that comes from tension, from people waiting for something to happen, from an unspoken expectation hanging in the air. A few heads turned as she entered, and for a moment she felt their eyes on her, the weight of their judgment, the scrutiny of her every move. There was no warm greeting, no welcoming smiles, just a room full of people who were waiting for her to make her move, to show them who she really was. One of the officers, a tall man with graying hair and a serious expression, approached her. His uniform was impeccably pressed, and his posture was rigid, like he was ready to hold her to some unspoken standard. This was Chief Stevens, the acting chief who had led the precinct before Marcia's arrival. He extended his hand, and she took it firmly, matching his gaze. She wasn't here to shy away from anyone. Not today. "Chief Wilson," he said, his voice formal. "Welcome. We weren't sure when you'd be arriving, but we've been expecting you." He paused, almost as if to gauge her reaction, before continuing. "I'm sure you're aware of the challenges this precinct faces. We have our way of doing things, and we expect that will continue under your leadership." Marcia didn't flinch. She had anticipated this. "I'm aware of the challenges," she said, her voice steady. "But I didn't come here to continue things the way they've always been. I came here to move this department forward." She wasn't going to sugarcoat it. She had no time for games. If we're going to change this city, we have to start by changing the way we work. There was a brief silence, and she could see the flicker of surprise in his eyes. But only for a moment. Chief Stevens quickly regained his composure, but Marcia could tell she had made an impression. Whether it was a good one or not, she didn't know. But she would make sure he remembered it. "Of course, Chief," he replied with a tight smile. "We'll see how that goes." Marcia didn't take his words as a challenge, not yet. She wasn't here to fight everyone at once. She was here to lead, to inspire, to show them that change didn't mean chaos. It meant growth. And if they couldn't see that, then they would have to learn the hard way. She was prepared for that too. She spent the next few hours moving through the precinct, meeting with officers, listening to their concerns, learning about the day-to-day operations. There was a certain weariness in the air, a sense that people had become complacent, too comfortable with the status quo. It was clear that many of them saw her as just another figurehead, someone they would have to endure before things could return to normal. But Marcia wasn't going to let that happen. Her first meeting of the day was with the head of investigations, Lieutenant Marks, a veteran officer who had been with the department for over 20 years. He greeted her with a cold nod, his arms crossed as he leaned against his desk. Marcia knew this wasn't going to be easy. He was an old-school officer, one who didn't take kindly to new ideas or new faces, especially not ones who were being thrust into leadership positions without the kind of history he valued. "I've read your resume, Chief," he began, his tone skeptical. "You've got a lot of experience, but experience doesn't always translate into leadership. We do things by the book here. And I'm not sure what you think you're going to change, but I'll tell you this. This department has been around a long time. It's not going to be changed overnight." Marcia met his gaze, not backing down. "I'm not trying to change everything, Lieutenant, but I will change the things that need changing. If you're not ready for that, then maybe you shouldn't be here." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Marcia thought he might dismiss her, might challenge her authority. But instead, Lieutenant Marks let out a slow sigh and sat down in his chair. "I've been here a long time, Chief, and I've seen officers come and go. You're not the first one to walk through that door thinking they could fix things, but maybe you'll be the one who actually does." Marcia gave him a nod of acknowledgement. This wasn't going to be easy, but it was a start. By the time the day wound down, Marcia had met with every key officer in the precinct. Some were receptive, some were guarded, but all of them had heard her message loud and clear. Change was coming. whether they liked it or not. As she sat behind her new desk, the weight of the day pressing down on her, she couldn't help but think about the challenges that lay ahead. She was the new chief, but she wasn't going to be handed anything. She would have to earn their respect, their trust, and that wasn't going to happen overnight. But one thing was certain: she wasn't backing down. Not for anyone. The challenge. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, reports, and introductions. Marcia Wilson had expected the challenges, but the reality of walking into a precinct where no one was quite sure how to treat her felt heavier than she had anticipated. There was an unspoken tension in the air that lingered long after her initial greetings. The officers, old and new alike, were sizing her up, determining whether she was just another in a long line of temporary leaders or someone who could truly affect change. And though she had already made it clear that she was here to shake things up, the small, lingering doubts in their eyes never fully dissipated. Her mornings were spent in strategy meetings with her leadership team. Marcia was focused, pushing them to think beyond their comfort zones, to come up with innovative solutions to the crime that plagued the city's darker corners. But the more she spoke, the more she felt the resistance, an invisible wall built over years of tradition, of doing things the old way. At the end of each meeting, there was a sense of frustration building inside her, a gnawing realization that while her plans were ambitious, the officers were reluctant to give them a real chance. Their faces remained passive, their reactions measured. It was as though they were waiting for her to fail, waiting for the new chief to make a mistake so they could return to business as usual. But Marcia wasn't a stranger to skepticism. She had spent her entire career being underestimated, overlooked. If they thought she was going to crumble under the pressure, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The evenings were no better. By the time the sun set, Marcia found herself alone in her office, sifting through reports and statistics, fighting the growing exhaustion that threatened to pull her under. She had always been a night owl, but this new role was demanding a level of energy and focus she hadn't quite prepared for. The sheer volume of paperwork, the constant stream of demands from the city council, the reports from community leaders, it was a whirlwind. And amidst all of that, she had to prove herself. Her office, once a sanctuary in her former positions, now felt like a battleground. The desk was cluttered with papers, her phone constantly buzzing with calls from various city officials, and her calendar seemed to have more meetings than hours in the day. But it wasn't just the work that weighed on her. It was the knowledge that the men and women in her precinct were watching, waiting, seeing if she would rise to the challenge or collapse under the pressure. One evening, as she prepared to head home after yet another exhausting day, Marcia was stopped by Lieutenant Marks in the hallway. He was standing near the elevator, a cup of coffee in his hand, his expression unreadable. It was clear he wasn't on duty anymore, but something about his posture, his stance, made it seem like he was trying to decide whether or not to speak to her. "Chief," he said, his voice low but firm. "You've been here a week now. You've shaken things up a bit, but there's something I need to make clear." He paused for a moment, as if considering the weight of his words. "This department is built on trust. You'll get respect when you've earned it, and not a moment before." Marcia looked at him, her face a mask of calm. The subtle challenge in his words didn't go unnoticed. She had known there would be people in the department who wouldn't give her an inch, but she wasn't here to beg for respect. She had earned her place, and she would prove it. "I understand," she replied coolly, her gaze unwavering. "But trust isn't built on compliance. It's built on action. I'm here to do the job you haven't been able to do. I'm here to fix what's broken." Marks didn't flinch at her words, but she could see the wheels turning in his mind. There was a moment of hesitation, almost as if he was trying to gauge how far she was willing to go. But in the end, he simply nodded. "We'll see how that plays out," he muttered before turning and walking down the hall, his footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent space. Marcia stood there for a moment, the weight of his words lingering in the air, but she didn't let them hold her back. She had a mission, and Not even the skepticism of a seasoned officer like Lieutenant Marks was going to stop her from fulfilling it. The next morning, Marcia entered the precinct with renewed determination. There was something about the interaction with Marks that had reignited a fire in her. She knew now that she wasn't just here to lead. She was here to challenge every officer in that building, to push them beyond their comfort zones, and to demand that they be better. For themselves, for the city, and for her. They needed to see that she was more than just a figurehead. She was their chief, and that meant they were going to have to follow her, whether they liked it or not. Marcia spent the rest of the morning in a meeting with her command staff, outlining her plans for the precinct's future. She laid out her vision for community policing, for better outreach in the city's most underserved neighborhoods, for a more proactive approach to crime prevention. She was blunt, giving no room for misunderstanding. She wasn't going to tolerate pushback, not from anyone. "I don't care how things have been done in the past," she said, her voice sharp, clear. "What matters now is what we do moving forward, and I will not accept failure. We will change. We will evolve. We will be better." The room was quiet for a moment, the officers exchanging looks, but no one dared speak up. It wasn't fear, it was respect. The kind of respect that came not from being passive, but from understanding that Marcia had the vision and the drive to make a real difference. It wasn't easy to shift the way they had been operating for so long, but it was necessary. They had to adapt, or they would be left behind. By the afternoon, she found herself on a ride along with a young officer named Harper. It was an initiative she had introduced to get more face time with the officers in the field, to understand their concerns, their challenges. Harper was green, eager, and clearly nervous to be driving the chief around. He kept glancing at her out of the corner of his eye, as if searching for validation, or a sign that he was doing something right. "You've been on the job for how long?" Marcia asked, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. 2 years, ma'am," Harper replied, his grip tight on the steering wheel. "Do you like it here?" she asked, curious. Harper seemed to hesitate before answering. "I do. But sometimes it feels like we're just putting out fires, you know. Like we're always reacting, never planning ahead. It's hard to see the impact we're making when everything feels like a crisis." Marcia nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "That's exactly why we need to change the way we approach this job. We can't just be reactive. We need to be proactive. It's about making connections with the community before they become problems. It's about working together, not just policing them." Harper glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. For the first time during their ride, he seemed to relax, his shoulders loosening. "I think I get that. I just didn't know if that's what you had in mind when you took over. I mean the old way. Well, it worked, didn't it?" "It worked for some," she said, her gaze steady on the passing streets. "But not for everyone. And it didn't make the kind of change this city needs." They spent the rest of the afternoon patrolling, and by the end of it, Harper seemed more confident, more at ease with the vision Marcia had shared. She knew it wasn't going to be an easy journey, but she had seen a shift in him, and that gave her hope. If she could change one officer's mindset, then she could change them all. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, Marcia reflected on the day. The challenge was far from over, but she wasn't backing down. She was going to keep pushing, keep leading with conviction. And if the officers in this precinct were unwilling to follow her, they would learn the hard way. She had one goal, and one goal only, to prove that she belonged here, not because of her gender, not because of her race, but because she was the best person for the job. And she would make sure they all knew it. Breaking the ice. It was another early morning when Marcia stepped into the precinct for the 4th consecutive day. The sun had barely risen, casting its soft, golden light over the city, but the heavy weight of expectation still hung in the air as she moved through the entrance. There was something almost electric about the quiet before the storm, a hushed stillness that felt as if the building itself was waiting to see what her next move would be. It had been a week since she'd taken over the precinct, And though the resistance hadn't come in the form of outright defiance, there was no mistaking it. It was the subtler kind. The quiet murmurings in the hallways, the sidelong glances exchanged between officers when they thought she wasn't looking. Marcia had always been able to feel the pulse of a room, and here it was palpable. They were unsure of her. They didn't know if she was just a temporary figurehead, someone sent in to appease the higher-ups, or if she was someone who was truly going to change things. And the longer it went on, the more determined Marcia became to prove she wasn't the first option. She had already shown them that she was no stranger to tough conversations, and now it was time to show them what she could do on the ground. If she was going to win their respect, it wouldn't be enough to sit behind a desk and call the shots. She needed to get her hands dirty, prove that she was just as capable as anyone else in the precinct, and then some. The day began like any other. She went straight to the briefing room, where the day's assignments were being handed out. She had scheduled an impromptu meeting with the shift supervisors to discuss upcoming cases and how she wanted to implement a few changes to their procedures. A few of the officers on the shift looked up when she walked in, but for the most part, the room remained relatively unchanged, the usual banter continuing in the background. The tension, however, was thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcia stood at the head of the room, her posture unwavering, and with a deliberate calmness, she began. "I've been in the field a few days now, speaking to officers, seeing how we're handling things on the ground. But I need your eyes on these cases. I need your input." She could see the flicker of surprise in a few officers' eyes, as if the idea that their chief was asking for their insights was both unexpected and somewhat unsettling. But Marcia wasn't just asking for feedback. She was trying to break down the barrier of hierarchy that too often created a divide between the front lines and the office. She didn't need them to see her as untouchable or too far removed from the action. "I'm going to take part in some of your patrols today," she continued, her voice steady and clear. "I want to see what's happening in the streets, understand the challenges you're facing in real time. I want to be out there with you, on the ground, not just reading reports at my desk." The response was immediate. The air shifted from quiet skepticism to something else, something Marcia couldn't quite define yet, but she could feel the change. She had always known the quickest way to break through barriers was to show up, to take the same risks and face the same dangers as the people she was leading. As the officers filed out of the room to start their day, Marcia prepared herself for the ride-along she had planned with a young officer named Thomas. He had only been on the force for a few months but was already showing promise. The ride-along was meant to be as much about observation as it was about connecting with the people who worked for her. When Marcia slid into the passenger seat of the patrol car, Thomas gave her a nervous but polite nod. He was clearly still getting used to the idea of having his new chief riding shotgun, but he didn't let his nerves show. "So, what are you hoping to see today, Chief?" Thomas asked as they pulled out of the parking lot and onto the city's busy streets. Marcia leaned back in her seat, her eyes scanning the area around them. "I'm not looking for anything specific, Thomas. I just want to understand what it's really like out here. I want to see what's working, what isn't, and how we can do better." Thomas nodded thoughtfully, his eyes flicking between the road and his passenger. "I respect that, Chief. I think a lot of people think you're just going to come in and change everything. But you're different. You actually seem to care." The sincerity in his voice took Marcia by surprise. In the past week, she had seen nothing but guarded expressions from her officers. It was refreshing to hear someone speak so plainly, without any of the typical barriers that most people put up around authority. "I do care," Marcia said quietly. "This job isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about protecting people, about being a part of the community. I can't do that if I don't understand what they're going through, or what you're going through out here." The patrol was a mix of quiet streets and chaotic intersections, with nothing particularly out of the ordinary happening, until they received a call over the radio. It was a 911 response to a domestic disturbance in a rundown part of the city, one that was notorious for its high crime rates. Without hesitation, Thomas flipped the siren on, and began driving with urgency, and Marcia immediately felt the shift in the atmosphere. The streets became a blur as they sped through the city, and despite the tension in her stomach, Marcia remained focused. They arrived at the scene in record time, but the situation was already escalating. The two officers on site were struggling to calm down the people involved, and the sight of Marcia's car pulling up made the situation even more tense. She had to act quickly. Thomas parked the car, and they both rushed out. The moment Marcia stepped onto the sidewalk, she saw the heated exchange between the woman and the man involved in the disturbance. The man was pacing back and forth, shouting, while the woman stood with her arms crossed, visibly upset but unwilling to engage. Marcia walked calmly toward them, her presence commanding attention, but not threatening. She kept her hands visible and approached slowly, offering a warm, but firm, greeting. "I'm Chief Wilson. Let's talk about what's going on here." The couple paused, turning toward her as they sized her up. For a moment, there was silence, both sides wary, uncertain. But Marcia's approach wasn't one of force or authority. She was there as a mediator, a problem solver. She wasn't looking to arrest anyone, but to understand, to calm the situation before it escalated further. "Everything's going to be okay," she said, speaking directly to the woman, who was now eyeing her with cautious curiosity. "I know it's hard, but we're here to help, okay? Let's take a deep breath and talk about what's going on." The woman nodded, her arms uncrossing slightly as she glanced at the man. The argument had gone on long enough, and the frustration on both sides was apparent. Marcia's calming words, combined with her confidence, broke through the tension in a way the officers on site hadn't been able to. They were still struggling to find common ground, but Marcia's instinct for reading people, for handling delicate situations, had already begun to pay off. After several minutes of careful negotiation, Marcia was able to de-escalate the situation enough for the officers to take control. No one was arrested, no violence had occurred, and the situation was resolved with dignity. The couple was separated temporarily, the officers now able to handle the situation more effectively. As Marcia and Thomas returned to their car, Marcia felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. They had averted a potentially dangerous situation without resorting to force, and the officers now saw her in action, not just as an administrator, but as someone who could lead in the most critical moments. "Good work today," Thomas said as he pulled away from the scene. "You really handled that well." Marcia nodded, but her mind was already on the next challenge. "It's about being present, Thomas. Understanding that it's not just about putting on a badge and a uniform. It's about making a real difference in people's lives, even if it's in small ways." For the first time in days, she felt a shift, a subtle yet important change in the air around the precinct. They were starting to see her as more than just the new chief. They were seeing her as someone who could make things better, someone who understood what it meant to be a part of the team. It was a start, and it was enough to keep her moving forward. But Marcia knew better than to rest on her laurels. She had made an impact today, but there were more battles ahead, and she was ready for every single one of them. The turning point. Marcia Wilson's resolve had been tested time and again since stepping into her role as chief of police, but nothing had prepared her for the day the precinct's true challenge emerged. It came in the form of a public crisis, a scandal that threatened not only her leadership but the very foundation of the department she was trying to reform. It started with a phone call. Marcia was at her desk, poring over community outreach reports when her phone buzzed, a sharp reminder that no day at the precinct was ever truly routine. She picked it up, expecting to hear the familiar voice of one of her staff. Instead, it was a journalist, someone from the city's biggest news outlet. "Chief Wilson," the voice said, laced with urgency. "We've received a tip about an internal investigation at your precinct. Allegations of corruption and misconduct. Care to comment?" Her pulse quickened. Her mind raced, trying to process what the reporter was asking. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a minor accusation. It was a full-on scandal, the kind that could ruin everything she had worked for. She stayed calm, though her heart pounded. "Who is the source?" she asked, trying to maintain control over the conversation. "I can't disclose that," the reporter replied. "But we have enough to run the story. Do you want to comment?" Marcia took a deep breath, her mind instantly jumping to the worst-case scenario. Could this be the result of the resistance from some of her officers? Had they found a way to undermine her before she could make a lasting change? She knew how fragile her position was, how precarious her ability to lead had become in the eyes of many in the department. It wouldn't take much for the old guard to strike back. "No comment for now," she said firmly, ending the call before the reporter could press further. Her first instinct was to dig into the story herself, to find out everything she could before the press did. But before she could even gather her thoughts, the door to her office opened, and Lieutenant Marks stepped inside, his face grim. "You saw the news?" he asked, his tone sharp. Marcia nodded, her eyes narrowing as she met his gaze. "I just spoke to the reporter. This could be big. Do you know anything about it?" Marks hesitated, clearly torn. "There's been talk. Nothing concrete. But the whispers are getting louder. People in the department are getting nervous." Marcia stood up, her chair scraping against the floor as she moved to her office window. She needed a moment to think, to clear her head. Her mind flashed back to the officers she had met since her arrival, some friendly, some neutral, and others who were downright hostile. She had suspected there were factions within the department, officers who resisted change in favor of maintaining the status quo. This news, this scandal, could be the result of someone trying to discredit her leadership, to take her down before she had a chance to make a real difference. "Who's behind this?" Marcia asked, turning to Marks. "Do you know who's leaking this to the media?" Marks shook his head, his jaw clenched in frustration. "Could be anyone. This isn't just about you, though, Chief. If these accusations are true, if there's any truth to them, it could mean a serious shakeup at the top. This department is rooted in some pretty deep corruption, and I'm not sure who is willing to spill secrets." Marcia's gut tightened. Corruption. She had suspected it, but hadn't seen it in full force until now. It wasn't just the officers she had to deal with. It was the system itself. A system that had long been built on favoritism, secrecy, and a lack of accountability. This wasn't just a challenge to her leadership. It was a challenge to everything she stood for. "You'll have to dig into it, Marks," Marcia said, her voice firm. "Find out where this is coming from. We need to clean house if it's true. I don't care what it takes." As soon as Marks left her office, Marcia set into motion a plan to confront the issue head-on. She couldn't afford to sit idly by, waiting for the situation to spiral out of control. She needed answers, and she needed them quickly. The next few hours were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and emergency briefings. Marcia convened with her top command staff, urging them to investigate every lead, no matter how small, and to ensure the integrity of the department was maintained. But the more she dug, the more complex the situation became. The internal investigation into allegations of misconduct was deeper and more far-reaching than she could have ever imagined. The department was riddled with officers involved in questionable activities, bribes, abuse of power, and even ties to criminal organizations. It was clear now that this wasn't just a rogue officer acting on his or her own. This was systemic corruption. As the day wore on, Marcia found herself grappling with a terrible truth. Her dream of bringing change to the precinct, of leading a department built on integrity and fairness, was under threat from forces within. She was facing the reality that the change she had set out to make might not come easily or quickly. In fact, it might come at the expense of everything she had worked for. That night, Marcia sat alone in her office, staring at the reports in front of her. She had never felt more isolated. Every ounce of doubt, every concern she had about her position came rushing to the surface. Was she the right person for this job? Had she underestimated the depth of the corruption in the department? Would she be able to root it out before it consumed her? Just as she was about to bury her face in her hands, there was a knock at the door. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. "Come in," she said, her voice hoarse. The door creaked open, and Lieutenant Marks stepped inside. He looked tired, his face drawn and serious, but there was something different in his eyes, something softer, something closer to respect. He closed the door behind him and took a seat across from her. "We've got something," Marks said quietly. "It's not much, but it's a lead." Marcia's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? Who's involved?" Marks leaned forward. "I think we've identified a group of officers who've been working together for years. They've been running their own operations, bending the rules when it suits them. They're embedded so deeply in the precinct's operations that it's going to take some time to untangle. But it's not just low-level officers, Chief. We're talking about some high-ranking individuals too." Marcia felt a chill run through her. She had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. These weren't just isolated incidents. They were the result of a corrupt system that had thrived for far too long. "How do we handle it?" Marcia asked, her voice steady but full of determination. Marks hesitated for a moment. "We take them down, one by one. We gather evidence, build our case, and make sure they can't cover it up. But this is going to be messy. You're going to have enemies within your own department, officers you thought you could trust." Marcia nodded. "I knew that already. We're doing this by the book, Marks. No shortcuts, no blind loyalty. If they've broken the law, they will face the consequences." The weight of what she was about to undertake was immense, but for the first time in days, Marcia felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about cleaning up a precinct. It was about taking down a system that had allowed corruption to fester unchecked. It was about showing the officers in her department that she would not tolerate any more betrayal, any more compromise. She was their chief, and she was ready to lead them through the hardest battle of her career. "I won't back down," Marcia said, her voice sharp. "And neither should you. We start now." For the first time since she arrived at the precinct, the uncertainty that had lingered in her chest began to fade. She wasn't just the new chief anymore. She was a leader with a mission to rid the department of the rot that threatened to bring it all down. And she would stop at nothing to make sure justice was done. The final stand. The next few days unfolded like a series of meticulously choreographed moves on a chessboard, each step calculated, each decision more consequential than the last. Marcia Wilson had always prided herself on her ability to strategize and adapt, but this was different. This wasn't just about changing the culture within her department. It was about dismantling a system that had been in place for decades, and it wasn't going to be pretty. By the time the sun rose on the 6th day after the scandal broke, Marcia knew that the final confrontation was fast approaching. The officers involved in the corruption ring had been identified, their connections traced, but the evidence needed to take them down was still elusive. They were careful, calculating, and had covered their tracks in ways that made Marcia's heart heavy with the realization that the road ahead would be paved with challenges. Her strategy was clear. She couldn't go in alone. She needed allies, trusted officers who were committed to cleaning up the force, no matter the cost. She also needed to keep the media at bay until they had a concrete plan in place. The last thing she wanted was to make a misstep and feed the narrative that was already spinning out of control. Marcia met with Lieutenant Marks early that morning, in a small, secluded room at the back of the precinct. The air was thick with anticipation, and the silence between them spoke volumes. They both knew what was coming. "We're getting closer, Chief," Marks said, his voice low but resolute. "But we can't afford to make a mistake. If they catch wind of this operation before we're ready, they'll scatter like rats." Marcia nodded. "I know. We need to be surgical about this. If we're going to clean house, we have to do it all at once. No one is above reproach, not even the ones at the top." Marks shifted uncomfortably. "What if it's one of us, Chief? What if someone close to you is involved?" The question hung in the air like a dark cloud, and Marcia felt a pang of doubt in her chest. She had spent every waking moment working to gain the trust of her officers, building rapport with them, trying to convince them that change was possible. But now, as the truth began to unfold, she understood the depths of her challenge. She couldn't just count on the loyalty of those around her. She had to be prepared for betrayal from the very people who had promised to support her. "I trust you, Marks," Marcia said, her voice steady. "But we have to be prepared for anything. If someone in this precinct is working against us, we need to root them out, no matter the cost." Marks met her gaze and nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. "I'm with you, Chief. We'll clean it up, one way or another." Marcia stood, taking a deep breath. "All right, let's move forward. The first step is securing the evidence. We need every piece, every phone record, every transaction, every file that ties them together. Once we have that, we'll make our move." They spent the next several hours going over the operation, reviewing intel and preparing to bring in trusted officers for the crackdown. It was a race against time, as Marcia knew that the longer they waited, the more likely it was that the corrupt officers would go into hiding or cover their tracks. Every moment was precious. At 2:00 p.m. that afternoon, the operation was set in motion. Marcia and Marks coordinated with several officers who had already proven their loyalty to the department's cause. These were the officers who had been with her since day one, the ones who had quietly supported her reforms despite the resistance. They were ready to stand by her side when the time came. They moved quickly and efficiently. One by one, they began to arrest the officers implicated in the corruption ring, swooping in without warning. Some of the officers tried to fight back, either physically or with frantic attempts to destroy evidence, but it was no use. Marcia had planned every detail, and the operation unfolded exactly as she had hoped. The corruption that had plagued her department for years was finally being exposed for all to see. But as the last officer was arrested and taken into custody, Marcia's heart sank. She had expected this moment to feel like a victory, but instead, there was a hollow feeling inside her. The department she had worked so hard to reform had been built on lies, and now it had to be rebuilt from the ground up. She stood in the center of the precinct, surveying the scene around her. Officers were busy making their arrests, gathering evidence, and documenting the operation's success. But even amidst the chaos, Marcia couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The work she had set out to do wasn't finished, not by a long shot. "Marks," she said, her voice firm. "We've done what we set out to do, but there's more to be done. We need to rebuild this department from the ground up. We need to show the community that we're serious about making things right." Marks nodded, his face showing a rare look of respect. "You're right, Chief. This is just the first step." As the arrests were processed and the precinct returned to something resembling normalcy, Marcia retreated to her office for a moment of solitude. The adrenaline from the operation still coursed through her veins, but there was a deep exhaustion settling in her bones. She had known this day would come, but the weight of it was heavier than she had imagined. The phone on her desk buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up and heard the voice of the reporter who had originally broken the story. "Chief Wilson," the reporter said, sounding more like a hawk than a journalist. "What's your response to the arrests today? Can you confirm that the officers involved were working in a corrupt network for years?" Marcia took a deep breath, steadying herself. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the moment when she would have to face the public and assure them that justice had been served. It was also the moment when the eyes of the city would be fixed squarely on her, waiting for her to respond. "I can confirm that we have made several arrests today, and the officers involved will face the full extent of the law. The actions of these individuals were unacceptable, and they betrayed the trust of the people they swore to protect," Marcia said, her voice unwavering. "This is just the beginning of our efforts to restore integrity to this department, and we will continue to work tirelessly to earn the trust of this community. I will not stop until justice is fully served." She hung up the phone, her hand still steady, but her mind racing. The press would cover the arrests for days, dissecting every detail of the operation. The community would have questions, doubts, and concerns. But Marcia knew one thing for sure. She had made the right decision. She had chosen to confront the corruption head-on, no matter the personal cost. In the weeks that followed, the city began to see the changes that Marcia had promised. New policies were enacted, old systems of favoritism and corruption were dismantled, and the department slowly began to rebuild itself. But even as the dust settled, Marcia knew that her work was far from over. There would always be resistance. There would always be those who preferred the old ways. But she was ready for them. She had shown her officers that she wasn't just a figurehead. She was a force to be reckoned with. She had taken down the corrupt. And now it was time to rebuild, to foster a culture of integrity, accountability, and respect. She wasn't just the chief of police anymore. She was a symbol of change, a living testament to the fact that even in the face of adversity, one person's determination could make a world of difference. Marcia Wilson had taken a stand, and the city, for the first time in a long while, was beginning to believe that change was possible.